And so that's how the Brent Venables era starts at Oklahoma. I would think most of us would have to give it pretty much overall the thumbs up. But of course, there's much to improve on for Oklahoma to reach its goals here in 2022. This is our Sooners live show that we present to you each and every Wednesday, 12:30 Eastern, 11:30 where it counts. Jason Ray makes it go. He's the guy that brings us our Oklahoma content on a regular basis. Jason, always good to see you. How's it going today?
You as well, Mark. Yeah, doing good, doing good. How about yourself?
I'm doing well, doing well. It was a heck of a weekend in college football with a lot of drama, a lot of exciting finishes, a lot of just tremendous games, and even some of the games that weren't the most scintillating, like that LSU Florida State game, suddenly became very uh, interesting and the wildest finish of the weekend. So yeah, just a great weekend of college football. Um, with all that we have to discuss, and some of it's fun, some of it's interesting, some of it's a bit aggravating throughout the off season. We get to the games, and the games rarely disappoint. Oklahoma, of course, with a different matter at hand against UTEP, 45-13 the final score. For you folks that like to lay a dollar or two on the games, they even pulled through for you, I believe. So your general assessment of what we saw against the Miners.
Yeah, Mark. I think it's about what I expected. For the most part, on both sides of the ball, there was a little bit of there was some timing issues. I think as you would certainly expect, kind of breaking in a new offense, a new quarterback, a new just all the newness that they had on the offensive side of the ball. There was a little bit of there was some timing issues from time to time between Dylan Gabriel and the receivers. But I think other than that, I think it was a solid performance on the offensive side of the ball. You saw Eric Gray had over 100 yards. You saw he was a little bit better between the tackles, at least early on, than he was last year. Marcus Major came in, and I think he had 7 carries for 54 yards and a couple of scores in the goal line situation. And then Javonte Barnes came in a little bit late and provided a little bit of excitement. He's a kid that you can tell is probably going to get more and more playing time as the season goes on. He's has a little bit of a different speed. I mean, he fumbled his very first carry, which is never a good situation. Obviously, when you're trying to fight for playing time and things like that, but looked pretty good in the last little bit that he got there in the fourth quarter. And I think defensively, I think overall from the fans' perspective, it looked a little bit uneven. Meaning, I think the team tackled really, really well, but I think there was some concerns from a secondary perspective in terms of how many yards UTEP was able to get through the air. But I think listening to and understanding what Venables and the defensive staff wanted to accomplish in week one, I wouldn't read too much into some of that coverage. They were very, very vanilla, in what they did defensively. I mean, it was mostly base coverage. They blitzed a little bit. They would blitz the linebackers from time to time, but it was nothing exotic in terms of what you typically see from a Brent Venables defense. So I think they were vanilla, and I think the challenge that they had for this defense was really, can they tackle in open space? Can they tackle in a much greater efficiency than they did last year? And it was really, really solid. They played 3 deep across the defensive side of the ball for the majority of the game. So I think to a certain degree, this was a little bit of an audition, just to see how well this defense could play. And they deployed a little bit of a bend but don't break defense. They only gave up the 1 touchdown and a couple of long field goals. So I think overall it was, like I said, about what I expected. Pretty solid. Obviously, you'll see more of the playbook open up as the season goes on. Probably not this week against Kent State, but certainly when they travel to Lincoln in a week or so, week and a half, I guess it would be.
Folks, of course, we'll get to your comments and questions. I see a few there in the chat. Want to get to a few other things first, because we see some big picture type questions there in the chat. But, the one thing that I brought up last week that I I wanted to get your take on, and then certainly see how it played out, was not just the distribution of carries for the running backs, but the use of the running backs. And so, of course, Eric Gray, as you mentioned, led the way with 100 plus yards. And he's certainly, from a talent standpoint and also an experience standpoint, the guy at this point. But just in regards to Javonte Barnes getting into the mix, he had 4 or 5 carries. And of course, Marcus Major. Jason, what were your thoughts concerning the use of the running backs?
Yeah, I think they ran. To your point, Mark, they got Eric Gray out of the backfield from time to time. He caught a fairly long pass over the middle, so they got him in open space a little bit. Didn't throw the ball to him a bunch. Again, I think they saved a lot on the offensive side of the ball, as well on the defensive side of the ball. But yeah, as you mentioned, Eric Gray actually ran between the tackles a little bit more, but that's their bread and butter. Inside run game, is their bread and butter, and what they run 90-95% of the time from a run game perspective. So you saw a little bit of the bulk that he was able to put on and kind of run between the tackles, carrying defenders from time to time for a few yards. I think I expected Marcus Major maybe to get a few more carries than he did, from a distribution perspective, as you mentioned. I'm pulling it up here, as we speak. And Eric Gray had 16 carries, Marcus Major had 7, and then you've got Javonte Barnes with 4. So I think part of it was a product of not necessarily time of possession, but as many possessions as Oklahoma had. They didn't run as many plays as Levy would typically like. You've only got, looks like they only had around 61 plays that they ran in the game. Levy ultimately likes to be in the 90s, but likes to really be in the 70s or 80s. So, there was some drives that they weren't able to sustain, kind of mid second quarter, early third quarter. But yeah, I think it'll be interesting to see how that continues to unfold. To your point, Mark, as the season goes on. There was a couple of times during the game where they got a little bit pass happy, and didn't run the ball as much. And then once they started running the ball, a little bit more, they became a little bit more consistent. And typically, I mean, they ran 38 times, passed through the ball 23 times. So that's about the mix that you would expect from a Jeff Lebby led offense. But yeah, it'll be interesting to see how that kind of continues to move forward as the season goes on. And I think Lebby probably had a pretty good feel of where he was at from a running game perspective with what he had with Eric Gray and Marcus Major and even Barnes to a certain degree. But I think they probably threw the ball maybe a little bit more early on just to see how that passing game looked and what the timing, because those are some things that I'd heard through camp, Mark, that the time they didn't feel concerned about it, that the timing would get there, but they said it's not where it needed to be. So I think that was very much, purposely, wanting to look and see what that looked like.
Ed, we always appreciate you being here. And no, there's no way Oklahoma can win 9 games this season. It's not going to happen. I don't see any possible path to 9 wins. Jeremy, we've got big picture. Here we go. When OU joins the SEC, how long will it take them to get to the college football playoffs with the new 12-team change? I mean, take no time.
That's
That's
right.
good news for anybody that's in Oklahoma's position. I ran the quick math on Ohio State in a 12-teamer, and outside the Luke Fickell year, they would have made 17 consecutive playoffs in 12. And the next team that came to mind was that's been that close to the top just consistently is obviously OU over the last 15 to 20 years. So my goodness, if they can continue, I know that the schedule is going to be tougher, but I think some people overplay the SEC schedule. Tons of talent. It's a gauntlet, all of that. But I think Oklahoma's generally been decidedly better than the Tennessees and the Texas A&Ms and the fill in the blanks of the SEC world. It's just having to play a number of them. And then, of course, you're running into Georgia and Alabama on occasion. Depending on how this pod or division system plays out, we shall see. But it's going to be fascinating, no doubt.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think one of the things from that question is really kind of understanding the meat of what the 12 team playoff will look like, just in terms of what does the automatic qualifier thing look like? What is do they cap in any way, shape, or form the number of teams from one individual conference that could make it? I don't necessarily see that happening, but I think nationally, a lot of people wouldn't want to see. I mean, I don't know what the appetite would be for like a three-quarters of a Big Ten SEC playoff matchup. So I think that will be interesting, but to see how that looks. But if, assuming there's no real, once they get the details ironed out, there's no real rules in place in terms of the maximum number of participants from every conference. You look at this, Mark, to make a 12-team playoff. 9-3 probably is what you need to be in a big time conference like SEC or the Big
Yeah.
Ten, right? Like
You're on the edge.
Big 12 team going 9-3, that's probably not going to make it, right? American team going 9-3, they're probably not going to make it. But with a conference like the SEC, if you go 9-3, you're at least in the conversation, depending on who those losses are. So yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think Oklahoma coming into that SEC, I don't think it's far fetched for them to, maybe not necessarily immediately, but we'll see how that works out over this next year and when this happens. But yeah, thinking that Oklahoma can get to a 9-3 season first year in the SEC, I think that's absolutely capable.
I had one of these notepads filled up with the scenarios of a 12 team throughout the 8-year college football playoff run. And uh, so it happens that, I had it all laid out and I presented it at some point. So it wasn't completely wasted, but it was only maybe 3 or 4 days before they came out with the 12 team playoff that I'd been looking at it for so long. I just ripped it up and threw it all away. But so I had it right there in front of me, but based on recollection, yes, the SEC and the Big Ten, they really fill up a 12-team playoff. If you're looking at this, I was looking at 5 conference champions making it, but we're now looking at 6, which is generally going to be a group of 5 champion, of course. Being in the mix, so that takes up another spot. But then you're looking at 6 wild card, if you will, and yes, the SEC and the Big Ten, based on the rankings over the last 8 years, really fill up those spots. And Jason, it's also, my goodness, the playoff committee is going to have a lot of decisions to make because there is typically, most college football seasons, a log jam of teams that are 10-2, weaker schedules, weaker conferences, 9-3, better schedules, better conferences between like 11 and 18. There's usually like 6 or 7, 8 teams that they're going to have to weed through and determine. There's going to be controversy there. And then you have that whole component of, you're a Wisconsin. I saw this a lot. You're a Wisconsin. Your record's worse because you went to the conference championship game. Do you get penalized for that? For having to face Ohio State that week, or, again, all over the country, especially in those 2 conferences, you see that all over the place. But I'm glad that we're there. I don't love the system. I have issues with it, but it's better than what we've had. And it may change college football. It may take a while, but it may change college football and open up more teams to building rosters that can compete, just like we saw during large portions of the 80s and the 90s into the 2000s until we came to this 4 or 5 team stalemate.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. I mean, I think one of the questions has long been, and maybe one of the concerns from the athletic directors and administrations, is how many games these teams play, right? So could potentially play. So if you have a 12-game regular season plus a conference championship, plus you get, the first four will get a bye. But let's say, the 5th ranked team, just for argument's sake, the 5th ranked team plays in a conference championship game, and then they could potentially be looking to play in what would that be, 3 playoff games to win a national championship. So you're looking at a 16-game season for some of these teams. So I think that's, in the grand scheme of things, what does that look like from a schedule perspective? Do they make decisions to? I can't see where they would stop playing the conference championship games just because of the money involved in those, but they could happen. Or do they shrink they shrink the regular season to conference season to a certain degree? Do they get rid of some of the non-conference games and just have a couple non-conference games? I think so. There's a lot of, to your point, there's a lot of considerations that will have to be made, just in terms of what that looks like, overall. And the argument, and I continue to see this argument over and over, and it's just one that I don't really completely understand and agree with, is how this lessens the regular season, makes the regular season more meaningless. And I just couldn't disagree more. I think it makes these November games so incredibly more more competitive, to a certain degree, with some teams that would feel like that they're out of it, with they've lost 2 games in November, and they're out of it. They're playing for a high tier bowl game now. They have an opportunity to sneak into the playoffs. So I just think it makes so many of these games much more specifically later in the season.
Yeah, we have a situation now where if you look at the last few weeks of the season, there are 3 or 4 or 5 games that are meaningful toward the playoff. And even some of those games are like, okay, Clemson's playing Syracuse. Okay, nobody expects them to lose. It's really not a meaningful game unless we have some kind of stunning upset. Then it becomes the most important game of the day. But if it's just follows script, rarely do we don't have that many games involving Oklahoma, Georgia, Ohio State, Alabama, etc., that are good matchups. So those are the meaningful games. And then everybody else, this brings into play LSU and Auburn are 7-2 the last week of October. As things currently stand, they're 2 really good teams that are ranked in the top 10 or 12 in the country, but
Right.
doesn't mean anything toward the playoff. Suddenly that becomes a huge game. And there's going to be so many like that yes, it opens up to there being 20 and 25 meaningful games the last month of the season each week. Yeah, I never understood that either. I understand the nitpicking out just specific situations to say, oh, Alabama's 11-0. Do they really need to win this game? No, they're going to be in regardless. I get that.
Yeah.
There are ways to safeguard that. And I think the committee's done that to a certain extent by saying, win your conference championship. Or does Alabama want to risk losing the conference championship and going to play in Ann Arbor or Madison, Wisconsin in December, week 1 of the playoffs?
Yeah, and that's a big thing that you'd mentioned there. Yeah, from an 11-0 Alabama or 11-0 Georgia, whoever it is that's 11-0. Yeah, it doesn't matter in the scheme of things in terms of the playoffs. Yeah, they're going to make it. But exactly to your point, do you want to face the fact of possibly having to play a first round game in Michigan, or just somewhere north where it's going to be very, very cold, and you're not playing in Florida or California or wherever, in what that typical bowl game, playoff game situation would how that would happen. So that's another consideration with some of these teams that will be hosting, which I don't love the fact that teams host on their own home field in a playoff situation, but it is what it is. I love the neutral side of it a little bit more, but for the first round, it's not that big of a deal. But yeah, the one big deal that comes to fruition is the times in which you're playing these games, times of the year, which would be in December. Outdoor stadiums and up north will be. You've just got inclement weather that some of these teams would potentially have to deal with that they're not used to. So I think that's another interesting within this 12-team playoff.
I like the home games because it's going to be something we've never seen before, except at the FCS level where there are playoff games on campus. So I find that exciting. The only thing I don't like about it is if I'm watching a game and let's say, so we've got the 5 through 12 seeds playing potentially on campus games. And so you got 5, 12, 6, 11. You've got a 7, 10, or 8, 9 game, and one of the two teams has a huge advantage by playing at home. And I'm guessing the 7, 10, and the 8, 9 games are going to be like pretty arbitrary in regards to determining who really earned this home field advantage versus, the 8th and 9th top teams in America. That's going to be a tough one to swallow for two teams that are both 10-2 playing in major conferences, and one of them gets a home field advantage based on just a committee saying they're 8th, they're 9th.
Right. Yeah. No, that's that's all part of it. And then, you think about when this might happen. I'm a proponent that I think they're going to do everything they can to make it happen in 2024. I don't know. I think they probably will get there just because there's so much money involved, right? There's so much money involved for these individual, to your point, the individual schools that get to host these first round games, and then there's so much money involved in these bowl games and things like that. You're adding more bowl games into a playoff situation than you have in previous years. I know there's some stuff that they've got to navigate through the current college football playoff agreement, but I think they're going to do everything that they can to get this started by 2024.
Jeremy's asking, how do we get the student section to stay longer at the games? I have absolutely no idea.
It's been a struggle at Oklahoma for a few years, and I think it kind of the students kind of got raked over the weekend because the student section was about half full, probably midway through the second quarter. I think a quick 21-0 outburst kind of does that to you, but I think I would cause ask for patience. Let's wait till we start getting into conference season and start having no disrespect to UTEP or Kent State, but formidable opponents, coming into Norman and some of those games. And I think that that will happen. But yeah, I think it's been a concern for for whatever reason. But I think the one thing that you give the benefit of the doubt, it was extremely hot in Norman on Saturday. They mentioned this on the broadcast a couple of times that field temperatures was ranging from around 105 to 110 throughout the game. And then people that were at the game, I heard from a lot of people that they were just like IMSA was just everywhere because people weren't prepared. So I think that's part of it that goes into it as well. A little bit, it can impact younger kids. I mean, just as much as it can some of the older. So I think that's something. Let's just wait and see what happens. And knowing Venables the way that we do, if that continues to be a trend, I'm sure that's something that he'll continue to challenge the students with and staying for the entirety of the game.
Gerard notes here that Oklahoma is number 4 in ESPN's updated power rankings. I don't think anyone here wants to see my top 25 rankings when it concerns Oklahoma, unless you just calm down and listen to me and understand things will be okay if they just keep winning. So a couple comments coming in about both lines of scrimmage. James says, line's a big concern. When Wanye Morris gets back, they can kick Guyton inside to left guard, and they'll have a solid starting 5. But yeah, last week the line struggled.
See, I've seen some commentary around that, but I don't see the same struggle that that happened, at least not to the degree that I've heard. This line struggled immensely against Tulane last year. Right in that game, they ran for some like 3 yards a carry in that game. Maybe not even quite, 3 yards a carry. 38 carries, 259 yards, 6.8 yards per carry on Saturday. So from a run blocking perspective, I had no concerns. I think not Wanye Morris, but Tyler Guyton got to start. I thought he played well. He got banged up a little bit. He had to go out a couple of times, and then they brought in really their third string left tackle, in which he struggled. He got he got kind of dominated on a couple of plays, but I think that's something that you would expect from a third string offensive lineman in Aaron Parks that really has never played. So, there was a couple pass pro situations where, maybe it wasn't the best. One where I thought Dylan Gabriel held onto the ball a little bit too long and took a sack, and then there was one when Tyler Guyton was out of the game. So I think to the point, I think that the offensive line will be much better, certainly when you get a guy like Wanye Morris back into the fold. But he's going to have to work his way back in just because he's eligible to play, I believe, against Nebraska. He's out this week, and then he'll be back next week. Be back the following week. I think he will still have to work his way back through the depth chart. It's not like he'll just immediately get his starting spot back. So, I think it'll be intriguing to see how that continues to move forward. But I take, at least for this first game, I don't, and this is the typical mindset that I've always taken over week one games. I don't overreact, good or bad, one way or the other. Yes, Tulane was horrible last year, but it was just one game, and but it ended up being more of a trend. Sometimes trends aren't trends can be broken after just one game, and then you see a lot of improvement. The most improvement that you see through a team typically is from game 1 to game 2. So it's not anything that I'm really concerned about right now. If it becomes a theme, certainly that's something that can be concerning. But one game, I don't really feel like that they struggle too bad, except for maybe a couple of pass pro plays.
All right. We will get to the rest of your comments and questions, everybody, for the rest of the hour. We want to get the quick take on Kent State. We got Steve Helwick on the line from Hustle Belt and Underdog Dynasty. Steve, how's it going today? Oh, Steve, I think you're muted for some reason.
No, still muted.
I don't have you. I don't believe it's on our. Let me see if I can't take it off. Huh.
Yes.
Huh. There we go.
Okay.
We got you, Steve. How's it going?
Yes, I'm doing pretty well with Labor Day weekend. That just means a shorter week for more football. So that's always a good thing. And we're only 2 days away from next college football kickoffs. So I'm ready for more data points, more games. Week 1 was wild. I was ranking the top 10 games of week 1, and I put Old Dominion, Virginia Tech at 10th. That's how crazy this past week was.
Yeah, it was a whole lot of fun. Not necessarily on the Oklahoma side, but Sooner fans are good with that. They got their comfortable win. They don't need any drama like they had week 1 last year. But Kent State's rolling into town, and of course, Oklahoma fans will deliver a little quick hit on Kent State. What do we expect from the Golden Flashes coming off about a 4-touchdown loss against Washington?
Yes, it took a while for Kent State to jumpstart its offense in that game, and it didn't really look as explosive as it did last year with Dustin Crum running the helm. But you can expect a lot of RPO and tempo with Kent State's offense. They run that flash fast scheme where they like to have minimal time between snaps. They like to run a lot of RPOs, spread out the wide receivers to the edges to give more space for the offense to work. So those are some of the things you can expect with Kent State's scheme. Now, their new quarterback, Colin Schlee, he broke in Seattle as a starter for the first time to replace Dustin Crum. He does have some elements of mobility that Crum had at Kent State to his game. He led the team in rushing and was really the only thing going well for Kent State in the run game, though. It wasn't the most accurate showing for him. He did throw 2 interceptions in the game, including one on his first pass as a starter ever, and that kind of put Kent State in an early hole. Kent State's defense didn't do any favors. Kent State's defense was a huge issue last year. They were bottom 10 in points allowed per game, and the 9 teams below them were all 3-9 or worse, while Kent State was appearing in the MAC championship game. So the offense was that good that last year that they had such a terrible defense and were still able to be successful. The defense didn't really show much promise in week one. I said they allowed points on each of their first 6 defensive possessions. So Washington got 38 points in that span, and the offense just couldn't keep up because it didn't have the explosiveness that it had last year. So it's going to be a bit of a learning curve for Kent State as they enter MAC play. And it's going to be really difficult because Washington is the easiest of their 3 FBS non-conference games, and they lost that by 25. Now they have to go to Oklahoma, and then they're going to have to go to Georgia later on in the season. So that is a brutal non-conference schedule for Kent State. So hopefully for the Golden Flashes, they can come out of this healthy, and they can come out of this as a better team for MAC play like they were last year when they played A&M, Iowa, and Maryland.
Yeah, the Kent State athletic department obviously looked for an opportunity to pick up a few extra bucks to help the department budget going on the road to those 3 locales. But there it is. Steve, in regards to Oklahoma and what you saw out of Dylan Gabriel and the offense and the defense versus Kent State, is there any path to any resistance here in regards to Kent State giving the Sooners a game here?
There shouldn't be much. I was really impressed with Oklahoma's first drive of the game in the first quarter in general. Those just looked like some really good scripted drives out there, and they were really using Dylan Gabriel's strengths to their advantage. I thought Oklahoma did a really good job calling that first quarter offensively. And you saw Gabriel with that first touchdown. He's added a lot more mobility to his game than when he was a true freshman in 2019. So you saw him run that zone read pretty well on that opening drive, and I think that's an element of Oklahoma's offense you might see a lot with him this year. But yeah, he throws a great deep ball. I think he's going to have a good connection with Marvin Mims. We only saw it a few times last week, but we might not see it much against Kent State. But later on, when Big 12 opponents come to play, I think that's going to be one of the most stellar QB receiver connections in the Big 12. And the one other thing I like from Oklahoma was I was on here a few weeks ago. I was saying you lose Nick Benito, you lose Isaiah Thomas. You need somebody who's going to generate your pass rush. And I think we saw Reggie Grimes as that successor to those guys in week one. So Reggie Grimes, I think, could cause a lot of havoc on that against Kent State's offensive line and provide a lot of pressure, which could make things a little difficult for Colin Schlee and company in this game. As far as a pathway, I don't see much with Kent State. They never really had that game close in the second half against Washington. And I think Oklahoma is far superior to Washington, especially on the offensive side of the ball. You look at the numbers that Michael Penix put up against Kent State as a passer. He was almost immaculate in that game, it felt. So I think that Dylan Gabriel can do even more. In Kent State's secondary, which ranked 116th in defending the pass last year, I think they're going to really struggle in this game, and Oklahoma is going to get an easy victory. And luckily for those in Norman, I think this game's going to be a lot cooler than the one that they were treated to the previous week.
All right, Jason, anything for Steve before we let him go?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's intriguing that I think Oklahoma and Kent State run. It seems to be a very similar offense. To your point, a lot of RPO, a lot of quick, snap the ball very quickly. But just from your perspective, compare Kent State and UTEP a little bit. Which team do you think is maybe a little bit more talented? Offense and the defensive side of the ball. Gavin was very, very impressed with his arm strength. I saw it a little bit, against North Texas in the first game of the season, and obviously last year. But just if you would just compare the two, in terms of offense, defense, and just overall, which team do you think is going to have maybe a little bit better of a season than the other one?
I think they could finish around similar records. UTEP is a lot more talented defensively. They have so much more in their front seven than Kent State has to offer when you have guys like Praise Amahule and Jadrian Taylor, who's a stellar pass rush duo in the CUSA, and they have good linebacking talent. Breon Hayward was all CUSA last year. Tyrese Knight is a pretty good tackler too. So I think that UTEP has a lot of guys in their front seven, which are really talented, and Kent State needs better tackling up front. I said they ranked 116th in pass defense last year. They rank also 116th in rush defense. They're returning all the starters basically from last year, so they're just hoping that that veteran, more reps under their belt, improves their team. So Kent State's defense didn't really look that great in week 1 against Washington. If you remember last year, the Huskies offense wasn't really good, but they did get a new coach, a new scheme with Kalen DeBoer. They got a new quarterback in Michael Penix, and Kent State did have a very difficult time stopping that in week 1. In terms of offense, Gavin Hardison likes to take a lot of deep shots. He has a pretty talented arm. He's probably the better of the passing quarterbacks, as we haven't seen too much from Colin Schlee yet. We just saw him play a bit in garbage time last year, and we have one sample data point of experience on Schlee as a passer, as a full-time starter. So I would give Hardison the edge in that department. But Kent State has, I think, better skill position players than UTEP. Last year, Kent State ranked 3rd in rushing, and they returned all 3 of their main running backs from that rushing attack. Didn't really get established against Washington, but I think when you see Kent State play FCS, their FCS opponent and MAC opponents, you're going to see some insane rushing numbers from the Golden Flashes, because their run calling is really creative in their RPO scheme, and they have so many different talented, versatile running backs, Brian Bradford, Marquez Cooper, and Xavier Williams, that can spearhead that rushing attack, ranked 3rd last year, just behind 2 service academies. And then you have a wide receiver in Dante Cephas, who had, over 1,200 yards last year, extremely talented. So I think that's one name that Oklahoma is certainly going to have to watch this week is Dante Cephas, who great combination of speed and strength and has some size too. So I think Kent State has an edge in the skill position players. UTEP more at passing and all around on defense.
Okay.
Steve, how was the LA doubleheader trip, USC, UCLA, and do you have any coverage plans for this weekend?
Yes, the LA trip, I think I executed that as flawlessly as I could have. I stayed 3 quarters at UCLA Bowling Green. I'll be honest, there was a moment in the game where I thought Bowling Green might have a shot to win. When it was 17-7, their defense was rolling, their special teams blocked a punt, recovered a muff punt, and it didn't look like UCLA was going to have the firepower to respond. But then it ended up 45-17. Bowling Green's defense suddenly fell apart, and the heat, which was also a theme in Oklahoma last week, 106 degrees, just caused so many cramping and injuries. But yeah, then I made the trek across town to USC Rice. Rice kept that close, ended up being 66-14 due to an onslaught of pick sixes at the end of the second quarter and the beginning of the third. But that was a cool experience to hit up both of those historic venues in one day. And as far as coverage plans this week, I will be going up to Big Ten country and covering Penn State versus Ohio in Happy Valley.
Good stuff. Catch Steve's work at Hustle Belt and Underdog Dynasty on SB Nation. Steve, we always appreciate you stopping by, breaking down the group of 5 for us.
Thank you. Appreciate it.
All right. Yes, Kent State and Oklahoma this week. Shouldn't be too much of a challenge for the Sooners. Shouldn't be. All right. You addressed the offensive front. There was another question concerning the other side of the ball with the defensive line not being able to get off blocks.
Yeah, I think you saw some inconsistent play on the defensive line. As Steve mentioned, Reggie Grimes had 2.5 sacks in that game. Played really, really well across the defensive line. But I think what you saw is, and I think one thing that's going to be a key indicator this year about how good Oklahoma can be defensively throughout the season, in terms of if they're able to get some pressure with just the front 4. If they're not able to get a lot of pressure with that front 4 and they're having to resort to sending a lot of blitz packages and things like that, then it puts your secondary certainly at some risk, if that's the case. But it'll be interesting to see. Again, game 1, we'll see how they improve from game 1 to game 2. I think if most people remember, Oklahoma came in with tons of talent last year on the defensive line and really underachieved for the most part, just across the board throughout the season. So we'll see if maybe it's a little bit differently. This team starts a little bit slower and gets a little bit better. But as I mentioned, very, very vanilla. So wait to see how they how they begin to come together. But I think what you saw out of Reggie Grimes makes you very, very pleasantly surprised that he can take a big step and be that pass rusher. And you've got Ethan Downs, you've got R. Mason Thomas, Marcus Stripling, guys that can rush the passer. But as I mentioned, they only blitzed a handful of times, and typically it was very much like if for Oklahoma fans that watched the spring game, the defense was very much the same. Like they brought some stuff up the middle from the backers, but they didn't bring people off the edge, and they didn't give a ton of different looks. So it's hard to really get a super good gauge on exactly how this defense is going to perform early on in the season. Again, and it's going to be the same for the most part, I think, this week with Kent State, but I think you'll see pretty much full playbook once you go to Lincoln in a couple of weeks.
Scanning the channel for questions that have come in and comments over the past several days since the game on Saturday. Don't see a whole lot there or in the live chat. There's a ton of comments to the channel, so we appreciate all your comments, but nothing that we haven't necessarily addressed. So you could blame no additional questions in the live chat for this one, because this is the one. Jeremy, I know most will hate this question, but what is your honest opinion on how Lincoln Riley started the season?
Yeah, I mean, I think when you look at the scoreboard, when you look at 66-14, obviously that's extremely impressive. But as Steve mentioned, that was aided by 3 pick sixes, which I mean infuriates people around here. I think because this was something that Grinch preached since the moment he was in Norman, and Oklahoma never really could turn the ball over except for one season at a high level that what Grinch had preached. To see him get to see USC get 3 pick sixes on the first game of the year. But when you
what year was that, Jason?
I'm sorry, what?
For the turnovers, what year did the defense?
I think I'm trying to remember. 2019 was the year where they were able to finally get a lot of turnovers on that on the defensive side of the ball. And then, but yeah, it's 14 to I was kind of keeping track of that game, a little bit, but it was 14-7. Rice was driving in to make it a 14-14 game, and then they had the pick six, and then it just kind of snowballed from there. But I mean, again, with USC, it was a little bit, I mean, not completely expected. I think from a score perspective, but I think you saw the explosiveness that team has, and so it'll be interesting to see what they have when they go to the farm. Saturday against Stanford, obviously a team that's going to put up much more of an opposition than what Rice did in week 1. But I think the only where you would possibly be concerned if you are a USC fan would just be the rushing defense. They were able to mask it by in a certain degree by the pick sixes and how efficient they were on the offensive side of the ball as well. But I think that'll be something to keep an eye on. I think it'll be going on about the same time as the Oklahoma game next week. I think that's a 6:30 Central kick, and Oklahoma kicks off at 6. But yeah, I think it was about as impressive as you would hope if you're Lincoln Riley, USC, a USC fan. But they did they gave up, what was it, 34 carries, 146 yards. So not terrible run defense, but I think you would look at the competition there. So that'll be interesting to see how that continues to go. And I think the benefit that USC has is, I mean, you saw Utah go down to Florida. You saw Oregon lay a complete egg against Georgia. And so you feel like probably if you're USC, you feel like maybe you do have an opportunity to get to that Pac-12 championship game. Um, but we'll see. Obviously you want to see how things go versus a different opponent for Oregon. Georgia looked, I mean, just as strong and as they were a year ago. Stetson Bennett looked even better than he was last year, and they replaced I think 7 or 8 starters on the defensive side of the ball, and they didn't look like they missed a beat whatsoever. So we'll see how that continues to go. But yeah, they have to like. I think they have to like their chances where they sit within where the Pac-12 sits right now.
Yeah, when you talk about roughly 35 rushing attempts for 150 yards against a quality opponent, that's a pretty stout, strong, decent rushing defensive performance. But against Rice, and considering I'm not even going to go to the top of the line, the Alabama Georgia level, just some top 10 to 15 defenses in the country, or top 10 to 15 teams in the country, their defenses, what you would expect against Rice. I would think that those numbers would be considerably less. So USC does have some work to do, regardless of what we saw on the scoreboard. Again, you can look at the 3 pick sixes a few different ways. Obviously, once a pretty talented athlete gets his hands on the football, most of those offensive players are not prepared to, or in the mindset that they're going to have to make a tackle on that play. So it's a situation where, yeah, the pick sixes are impressive, but that's just an anomaly that's not going to happen otherwise. 3 of those, you rarely get one, maybe 2 to 3 during a season. And so they get 3 there, kind of puffs up the score. But, they took care of Rice at a rate that USC should, versus maybe what we would have seen the last few years where, they win that game, 28-10 or 31-14, something like that. All right. Comment here coming in from Clay about Javonte Barnes. Seems to have more explosiveness than the other backs. What are your expectations for him? We did address the running backs, but anything there?
Yeah, no, I mean, I expect as he continues to work, I think he'll get certainly some more opportunities in competitive games. Obviously, it was early on in the obviously first game of the season, and he got there and kind of garbage time situations. But yeah, I think it'll be one of those things that he'll continue to get more and more carries, and they'll put more on him to see what he can produce for this team. But yeah, I think always the question with younger kids is pass protection. How well is he able to do in the pass blocking situation? But I think moving forward, I think he at least was able to show the team what he could do in a real live game, and then yeah, I think he'll continue to get more carries as the season goes on for sure.
Matt and others, also keep in mind, if you're just joining us here, we're almost wrapped up, but keep it right here. Catch what you missed, the video posts, and you go back and watch what you weren't able to catch the first time around. I did a rundown. I have yet to produce the video, but I went through each conference and just the performance over the weekend. So looking at the Big 12, you've got basically wins across the board, except West Virginia went to Pitt. I don't think it's a black mark on the conference by any stretch of the imagination. That game went right down to the wire. West Virginia was probably playing a bit up in class if you're comparing where the two teams sit in their respective conferences. So I think that was actually probably a good performance for the Big 12. And otherwise, the conference just pretty much held serve, Jason.
Yeah, absolutely. There's no, to your point, Mark, there's no real surprises. West Virginia kind of snatched defeat from the jaws of victory, so to speak. Had a lot of control. I mean, and you kind of felt bad for West Virginia and just the manner in which they lost that game, just a drop. on that one pass, and ended up being a pick six there. But yeah, I think the one thing, a couple of things kind of came out just were noteworthy for me. A little bit surprised defensively that Oklahoma State struggled the way that they did in the back end, particularly in the second half, giving up 29 points to Central Michigan, over 400, almost 450 yards through the air. I knew I think we kind of knew with what Oklahoma State lost in the back half of the secondary would be a little bit more um, of a learning curve, but didn't really think it would happen that quick with with that team early on. I think TCU, Colorado might be one of the worst Power Five teams in the country this year, but TCU kind of sleptwalked through that game a little bit and still won the game by 25 points. I know that Chandler Morris got hurt a little bit, but still had no problem whatsoever with Colorado. And I think the one thing it's probably going to have some eye rolls here, but I thought watching Kansas, you could tell that they have they're more athletic of a team than they've been in the past. Typically, I know it was an FCS opponent, but typically, over the last 5 years, even FCS opponents, they've really had to struggle. They've had to, scratch and claw to win those games. And on Friday, they beat Tennessee Tech 56-10. They were actually leading 56-3 before Tennessee Tech scored a late touchdown, and they dominated that game. So, I think Kansas is going to continue to be better. I think it's a very interesting week 2 game against West Virginia to see where they're at early on. Both teams, I think, how does West Virginia rebound from that heartbreaking loss, and where is Kansas at there? So I think that'll be interesting to watch for next week as well.
So noted on the banner, 9-1 for the Big 12, pretty much just holding serve against inferior opponents. So no big impressive wins. There was a Power 5 win, as Jason noted, but we could probably name off 25 Group of 5 teams that would be better than Colorado. So no great accomplishment there. But this week, okay, I don't know outside of Austin, Texas, or the state of Texas that many people expect the Longhorns to beat Alabama. So that's going to be one of those deals where, at least from my perspective, if Texas is competitive in that game, I will notch it as a good mark for Texas, a plus for the conference, all of that. I do not in any way expect Texas to beat Alabama. There are some other intriguing games here. Missouri and Kansas State playing in Manhattan, an interesting SEC Big 12 matchup that seems to be pretty even. I would give the lean to Kansas State there. Houston, Texas Tech. Houston had that really good season last year, 12-1. Their only loss was to Texas Tech in the regular season before they lost to Cincinnati in the conference championship game. So those two get back together. Iowa State at Iowa. Cyclones have lost 7 consecutive games to Iowa. If you didn't catch this score, 7-3, Iowa over South Dakota State. The 7 came via 2 safeties and a field goal. And then the other one's Baylor BYU. That's an intriguing game for sure, with Baylor scheduling a decent non-conference opponent for the 2nd consecutive year. So I'll give them some accolades.
Yeah, no, it's a really good week.
Yeah.
For the Big 12 out of conference, and my gosh, how impressive was! I mean, I know it was Utah State, but they were a 10-win team a year ago, won the Mountain West, and they made them look like an FCS opponent. Just didn't score a point, and I think they had less than 175 yards of total offense. So, they luckily for Alabama, they got through the rebuilding year last year, and they look to be much stronger, at least defensively. So I think Texas, with their young offensive line, young quarterback, going to have a lot of problems, blocking those guys up front. Dallas Turner, Will Anderson, those guys. And then, you've got a lot of intriguing matchups, like you mentioned, Missouri, Kansas State, Houston, Texas Tech. But I think BYU Baylor is the most intriguing one for me. BYU has a chance to be this year's Cincinnati. I don't know that they can make it to a playoff spot, but I think they have probably they're the strongest, I think, in my opinion, at least early on, non-Power 5 team, and so they get an opportunity host Baylor. Both of those teams look pretty impressive last year, although Baylor did it against FCS Albany, but 169-10, and then BYU, as you mentioned, that they kind of handled that game against USF for the most, for the entire game. So I think that'll be very, very interesting to end the day there as well. But yeah, tons of, and we didn't even mention Arizona State, Oklahoma State. So tons of intriguing matchups in the Big 12 this week.
Yeah, as Matt mentions, Matt, to be clear, I was saying if Texas can be competitive. Do I expect them to be competitive? Even though, again, I always smirk and chuckle when I start to talk about Texas, just the best collection of athletes and talent in the nation, where basically none of those individual athletes and the team collectively has accomplished anything. I can't think of another team in the nation like it. They don't know success. None of those athletes know anything about success. They haven't proven anything. They're all really talented. And I'm not taking away from guys like Xavier Worthy as an individual. He's been tremendous. Marshawn Overshawn, those guys are tremendous players. So I don't want to take away from what they've done on the field. But I mean, from a scoreboard success standpoint, nobody's accomplished anything. And they are playing the very top of the line gold standard. And so, man, I can't imagine it's going to be an Oregon-Georgia score, but I almost have that kind of feeling that it's going to go in that direction. So that's what I'm thinking.
Yeah, no, I'm with you. I'm with you. And I think the score was a little bit, they beat Louisiana Monroe 52-10, and I think the score was a little bit misleading. They were less than 400 yards total offense, and they were kind of up and down. Didn't run the ball extremely well. So yeah, I think it'll be very interesting to see how they can, if they can move the ball. I mean, I think if they score 14 points, I mean, they could consider that, certainly consider that a victory against that defense.
There we have it for another week of Oklahoma Sooners Live. Catch Jason after the game this Saturday. So again, kickoffs at what time? 6:30 Central?
6 p.m. Central for Oklahoma.
6 p.m. Central for Oklahoma and Kent State. So roughly about 9:30 Central, something in that range. But obviously, it's a post-game show after the game or whenever Jason decides to crank it up. You can join Jason right here at the Voice of College Football OU. Jason, appreciate you being here. As always, making this thing go each and every week. Folks, bring back yourself and a friend or 2 or 50 next week, and we'll do it again. Jason, thanks so much.
No problem. Thanks, Mark.